In this lecture, I'm going to be reviewing the major points about India that are found in Chapter 12 of your text. This is going to be really an oversimplification because, and your text also tries to do this, simplifying around 1,000 years of history to kind of skip to today and discuss modern politics in India. This is one of the BRICS countries, so it is sort of known for a duality, meaning that there's new wealth and there is, in fact, a wealthy class, but there is also a continuing problem with poverty and issues affecting a good portion of society related to disease and quality of life. We're also talking about a country with a very rich and storied political past that is going to be summarized here, and some elements will be missed. So again, I encourage you to read the chapter. So the land that we consider India was settled at least by 1500 BC by a group of people known as the Aryans. There is some information in the supplemental pages that I listed in your syllabus that goes along really well with sort of the biological origin of the Indian people. And they were a thriving territory until around 1000 AD, when the Muslim conquerors came through. And so for around the next 6 to 700 years, they were a colony of Muslims known as the Mughals. And toward the end of the 17th century, the Mughals began to kind of fall away, and they themselves were destroyed, and the British Empire replaced them. So India spent the next 250 years under the domination of European foreigners. The roots of Indian independence go back to the late 1800s with the formation of the Indian National Congress, but true independence was not achieved until after World War II. Britain also partitioned this region into India and Pakistan, but left some Muslim individuals in India and some Indian people in Pakistan because of the way they drew the state lines. And this caused a lot of civil strife. And this is the strife that saw the assassination of Gandhi. After this, the Indian state was somewhat consolidated, and Nehru as prime minister from 52 to 64 under a period of relative stability. After he dies, Indira Gandhi is elected, and she was a female leader. She was very committed to socialism, and she had a sort of authoritarian bent and began to consolidate power within the Congress. So she actually was assassinated, and her son took over, and he also was assassinated. In terms of structure of the government, India is a presidential parliamentary hybrid, which means that there are separate elections for the office of the president. However, the majority of political power and legislative power lies within the prime minister. Today, those people, the president is Ramnath Kovind, and the prime minister is Narendra Modi on the right. They do have a bicameral legislature, but the lower house is notorious for being extremely powerful. They are mostly elected through single-member district systems, but they still manage to have a multi-party system, largely because of regional diversity. There is a lot of ethnic, class, and linguistic diversity, as well as geographical diversity among Indian people. In addition, India runs a federal structure which allows for a lot of state and territorial decision-making. Until 1989, the lower house, which is known as the Lok Sabha, was governed by the Independence Party that was formed really by the few Indian political elites in the late 1800s. And they began to lose widespread popular support by the late 1980s. And so they formed what is known as the Janata Dal Coalition, which was really more or less a broad-based coalition that began to kind of shift between some of the regional ethnic and caste parties that were winning local elections. So it was quite a tenuous sort of coalition. And because of the multi-party scenario that's presented in the Indian Congress, it is very difficult for them to pass legislation, and there are pretty sharp divisions in society that basically lead to increasing gridlock and not very productive government. However, this is still considered a stable democracy. Now, I want to qualify that by saying that stable, meaning that the institutions of democracy are maintained and there's no immediate threat to that regime. So the political culture of India has largely been held together, especially since the kind of initial decades, because of support for independence. But sometimes regional, caste, and linguistic and religious divisions do have significant impacts on what happens to people in their political life there. One example of that would be the current conflict happening because of a new citizenship law that was passed by the ruling party, the BJP, that sort of limits the citizenship rights of Muslims. This has led to violence and hate crimes against Muslims in that country. So Hindu nationalism is extreme. The BJP is a Hindu nationalist party. In addition, there are organizations like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is a militant right-wing Indian Hindu nationalist paramilitary volunteer organization that perpetuates a lot of violence. Muslims and Sikhs are the two other major groups, religious groups within the country, and they've often faced political violence and state-sponsored violence. And in addition, caste, which has been criminalized more or less, is still very influential in guiding people's careers and marriages. Although there are, some liberties that people have as far as marriage that didn't exist before, but poverty is still pervasive and still concentrated in the lower castes. And Indian elections are the largest human events when they happen. It involves the majority of the people. The government takes great strides to include every single citizen's voice in voting. This process can take up to a month because they're trying to gather the votes of 417 million people, some of them who do not have access to running water or phones, and they are known to actually take voting machines out into the smallest villages that have one or two people living in them. And just to give you some small idea of the linguistic diversity, this is a map that's broken down into the regions based on the majority of the languages spoke there, which language has the largest people speaking it. This map is to show which districts were won by which parties. In the original PowerPoint, it is much clearer, but this also shows the large growth in the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. And some comparative data between the 2009 and 2014 election illustrates what has been known as the saffron surge, and also comparative data between 2014 and 2017. And this has been troubling to some scholars of democracy who view the growth of the influence of a party in a previously sort of multi-party scenario, but also that it has such nationalist tendencies, that this could have negative outcomes for democracy. The government's largest challenges, in addition to poverty and development, have been related to political violence and terrorism, including the couple of weeks of violence that erupted in the Gujarat region between Hindus and Muslims, where there was mob violence against one another, and then the famous Muslim terrorist attacks in Mumbai in 2008. And some of this is kind of in everyone's memory as the tension between Hindus and Muslims over the citizenship law and protests against the citizenship law that disadvantages Muslims. And so this also is a concern, both from the governance standpoint, but also from kind of the philosophy of democracy. India is a growing economy and it has been flourishing really since its independence, has gone through several phases. One of the original phases after independence included ISI, the building of a strong industrial sector that was almost authoritarian in its control by the government over industry. However, and this is another one of the ways that India is sort of a duality, there's also been a strong commitment to social democracy and political participation and redistribution. And this has involved the government fueling what was known as the Green Revolution, the inclusion of, building technology into the agrarian system and ending poverty and growth. Ending poverty and fueling growth. This has been very slow, however, and a lot of that has to do with the size of the population and the fact that they were undergoing a dual transition of democracy and economic transitions. So again, prior to the 1980s, India followed import substitution industrialization from early independence until the 1980s. This included a strong public sector, a lot of influence by the government over industrial policy, where there was a mixture of government and private ownership, very high tariffs and regulations, and this did actually protect Indian infant industry somewhat. But by the 1980s, they began to liberalize to the outside and removing some of their barriers to investment, although the government still had some limits over their capital markets. They began to sell off some state-owned industries and allowing for private ownership of automobiles and airlines. But they also became an important global hub for information technology and telemarketing and tele-customer service. There are Silicon Valleys now littered throughout India. They are the site of a quarter of all offshoring, 1/4 of all U.S. offshoring jobs. And they have managed to also grow their exports at 20% annually since the 1990s. They are responsible for over $100 billion in goods. So this means that they are growing at a rapid pace starting since the 1980s. But while the overall GDP has grown, the number of exports have grown, there is the situation that persists that they know as ultra poverty, where about 1/6 of this population earns 25% less than they need to actually survive. And poverty at kind of the moderate rates impact at least 300 million Indians. In addition, there are really sharp inequalities between the lower earners and the top earners, and women are more likely to fall victim to poverty due to lower literacy rates, lower education rates, and child marriage. And the state attempts to kind of mitigate poverty have had varied success. And really, just a concluding note on the political culture of India that is really sort of evident through previewing their media. They produce around 2,000 daily newspapers. Until the 1990s, most of the media was owned and controlled by the state, or at least owned by the state. Today, 200 million people have access to cable and satellite, so there's a growing entertainment industry. If you're familiar with Bollywood, that's really obvious. and becoming really kind of globalized. But this is kind of an interesting feature that I would say is a result of colonialism and the spread of whiteness as kind of the ideal of beauty.